Hello and welcome to the Mobalytics patch 11.11 tier list. I'm Danox Harrison and there's a lot of tweaks on this patch but not too many massive individual changes. We'll be breaking down our team of experts' initial thoughts on how things will develop over the patch. So let's get stuck in. Starting off with the top lane, in the God tier we have Sion and Cho'Gath, and in the S tier we have Wukong, Nasus, Malphite, Garen, Mordekaiser, Set, Shen, Urgot, Ornn and Kled. Top lane had a lot of itemization changes on this patch. The most major one is Bramble Vest being nerfed. It now has less armor and deals less damage to targets who attack you. This is a pretty significant change as it was a really popular rush in a lot of situations for a variety of top laners. It's difficult to fully know the scope of this change and how it will impact top lane, but ultimately it's going to be significantly less desirable as a rush unless you're specifically facing champions with heavy sustain. Divine Sunderer had a buff which may open it up to being used more frequently, but it's been pretty underwhelming compared to other top lane mythics, so it remains to be seen. Black Cleaver was buffed slightly but was already in a decent spot. It simply wasn't as big a priority as it used to be before this season. Frozen Heart and Randuin's both received buffs as well. The damage reduction against auto attacks now has a base number, meaning the items are much more powerful when bought early and still better until you've stacked a massive amount of HP. Onto our highlight picks. First up is Sion. He's been a rock in the top lane. He's bulky and scales incredibly well, but he's also got solid laning to help him get to that point. He isn't able to rely on Bramble Vest anymore, but he still has strong enough laning that he can get through and become a monster in the mid to late game. His ultimate with his Q to follow up can demolish backlines, and it becomes ridiculously tanky and hard to take down. With the changes to Randuin's and Frozen Heart, he has even better anti-AD carry items, and with his W giving him free HP, he is fine taking Frozen Heart and not suffering from the lack of HP on the item. Next up is Mordekaiser. He's been really successful in recent patches. At lower ranks in particular, he's holding his own in the laning phase. Ultimately, his dueling potential is really hard to deal with. A lot of champions just lose to his raw base stats, combined with the fact that he's stealing yours as well. When it comes to teamfights, a lot of immobile top laners can struggle to find headway, but Mord's ability to turn things into an isolated 1v1 always has value. You can either pick an easier target who you can finish off to steal their stats, or a strong target to isolate and annihilate. AD carries are often a good choice in this. Ornn is another tank top laner who's been looking great at lower ranks. It goes without saying that his late game scaling combined with his team fighting make him a huge asset, particularly when low mobility AD carries are so popular in the current meta. With tank itemization being buffed over the past couple of patches, he's in a great position, especially as he scales so well with items thanks to his passive boosting his armor and MR he receives. Ornn's damage is also pretty good. Into melee laners he can hold his own, and when played correctly can trade effectively with his CC chain. Ornn isn't the easiest tank to play, but he's very effective and a good Ornn ult will dictate a team fight. Moving on to the jungle, in the God tier we have Volibear and Xin Zhao, and in the S tier we have Warwick, Zac, Amumu, Diana, Nunu, Nocturne, Shaco and Elise. Jungle hasn't shifted too much. We did see a big nerf come in for Morgana, essentially reverting her jungle clear to just above what it was before she was buffed. It's likely she'll still function as a jungle pick, but one of her big strengths was hit hard with this change. Other than Morgana, we saw slight nerfs to Lee Sin, Rumble, Elise and Shaco. All four aren't going to massively be affected by the changes and have remained in a similar position. The exception is Lee Sin, who is actually performing better at lower ranks than we expected initially, so has moved up on the list. Master Yi also received a change where his Q-AD ratio was nerfed and returned his E on hit damage was buffed. This change is mostly because of the tendency of Master Yi players to go Dustblade and a Lethality build and burst targets rather than the old Rageblade on hit build. It may shift up his power, but ultimately we kept him in the same spot on our list for now. Starting off with the highlight picks, we're looking at Warwick. He's been solid at lower ranks for quite a while, but particularly with farming junglers being edged out, he's in a good spot. Warwick is a champ who does clear quickly, but with camp spawns being longer, he gives him more time to find effective ganks. His skirmishing is powerful, and his ability to chase down low health laners who have overstayed can easily rack up kills in the early game and allow him to snowball. There is some variety in builds. Sunfire is common when going pure tank, but Divine Sunderer gives him a lot of damage and has been buffed on this patch. Ultimately, Warwick spikes really hard in the mid game. Being able to lock down a target with his ultimate and render them useless has a ton of value. Nocturne is very effective and very difficult to play against. The threat of his ultimate constantly has to be on the mind of any team facing into him, and he's really hard to duel, especially with his current bruiser build. Once Nocturne hits level 6, the threat of his ultimate makes it really difficult for laners to deal with. They're either forced to play defensively whenever he could be nearby, or they risk being ganked and punished heavily for any aggression. Even in the later stages, Nocturne is still a big threat. Dive in the backline, he can buy a ton of time and disrupt and separate teams, and has more than enough damage to kill squishy targets. Fiddlesticks is a really powerful solo queue champion. The power of his ultimate is enough to single-handedly win teamfights, and often there's a big tendency at lower ranks for players not to respect the fog of war, which allows him to get huge engages onto the enemy team. Outside of using his ultimate, Fiddle excels in skirmishes with smaller number of players. His fear combined with his huge amount of healing on his drain allows him to do really well in 1v1s or 2v2s. Look to get a jump on your opponent by hiding your brushes and open with a fear and your burst damage to push things in your favour. Onto the mid lane, in the God tier we have Diana, Lux and Annie, and in the S tier we have Nico, Malzahar, Ahri, Fizz, Anivia, Echo, Zed, Yasuo and Katarina. Mid has overall been pretty uneventful on this patch. A lot of the changes were the champions who aren't really prevalent in low elo or solo queue, as Zed had his Q mana cost reduced and Ryze had his HP per level buff, but both are sitting on abysmal win rates right now at low ranks, and this is unlikely to change that. Lux had some solid buffs last patch to her E damage and it's made a pretty significant difference. It helped to have an easier time clearing up waves and added some damage to a burst combo. Lux is pretty consistent in being able to trade heavily with a lane opponent while relying on her shield and binding to keep herself safe. In the later stages of the game, she's a huge threat in finding picks as a single binding connecting means her ult is likely going to follow, and particularly after level 16 her ult cooldown is so short you can even just throw it out for poke. Annie has consistently sat at the top in our tier list and it's for good reason. Her consistent laning thanks to her easy CSing with her Q, combined with a simple but effective rotation, makes her a solid pickup for any mid laner looking for consistent results. Her combo with her ultimate is enough to annihilate squishy targets, and when used in unison with her flash, you can easily dispatch high value opponents from a good distance away. When playing Annie, look to find opportunities to roam and look for ganks in the side lane or skirmishes. The fact you bring in solid damage and hard CC makes these very effective and a good way to snowball. Once Annie is ahead, she's devastating and really hard to deal with. Next one's a bit spicier. Set mid is something that's been shown up frequently at high elos, and although not as popular at lower ranks, it's still performing really well. You're able to brush off most harassment from your lane opponent while constantly threatening them with your engaged potential. You're really effective in skirmishes, and due to your threatened lane, can look to find priority in roam. Whether you're joining in with fights bot lane or helping your jungle invade, you're capable of locking targets down, dishing out huge bursts and being a hard target to kill, which altogether makes you excel. Once you get into the later stages, look to find flanks in team fights or just grab a frontliner and dunk them into the enemy team's backline to instantly come out ahead in a fight. On to the AD carries. In the God tier we have Tristana, Jhin and Sivir, and in the S tier we have Ashe, Jinx, Misfortune, Kog'Maw, Seraphine, Swain and Vayne. With AD carries, we saw a buff to Ezreal's health regen and based armor. It won't change his place on the list, but it's definitely a nice boost that he needed. We also saw Halo Blades nerfed. Its cooldown is now 12 seconds instead of 8. The champion this hurts the most is Kai'Sa, as prior to this her Q cooldown lined up exactly with the 8 seconds Halo Blades CD. This allowed you to use them together to contest wave priority or look to trade with your opponents. Outside of Kai'Sa, the rune was used by Kog'Maw and Tristana, but they both have alternatives and shouldn't be affected too much. Sippen's Fang also got a buff. The shield reduction is higher when applied by a ranged champion, however we don't see this item being picked up too much by AD carries. There is definitely a place when playing into a heavy shield composition with champs like Seraphine however. Onto the highlight picks, and first up you might be getting a bit of deja vu. We're talking about Kog'Maw again, but mostly because of a new build that's been popularized and is actually getting even stronger on this patch. The build consists of a Wit's End Rush, followed by a Runans and then a Randuin's Omen, although in some situations you can even build a Randuin's second. The reason this build works so well is Kog'Maw has so much innate damage in his kit, which the Wit's End then bolsters. Combine the MR from the Wit's End with the armor and health from Randuin's and you become super tanky and hard to take down, but you're still shredding targets thanks to the damage from your W. We haven't highlighted any particular mythic here because there's so much flexibility. Shield Bow helps your survivability, Gale Force gives you a very valuable dash, and Kraken Slayer gives you the most damage overall. Ultimately, all three are viable and it comes down to what the situation is in your game. Against something like a Malphite, you'll find a lot of value in Gale Force being able to dodge his ultimate. Against like a Nocturne, Shield Bow is a huge asset to help you survivors engage, and into any scenario where you have enough peel and safety, then Kraken Slayer will help you dish out more damage and shred through tankier targets like a Cho'Gath or Sion. Onto our next pick, and Ashe, and she's a really consistent laning champion who scales well and remains relevant throughout the game. Harassing with volley and her long range autos gives her a strong 2v2, and thanks to her slow it's tricky for opponents to opt out of fights with her once in range unless they have a dash. Once you hit 6 you can start looking for picks with your ultimate and it makes your 2v2 potential even better. Paired up with support with CC as well, you can easily layer it and look to pick up easy kills with little chance of a return kill from your opponents. There is some difficulty in keeping safe with your ability, so in the later stages it's important to make sure you're positioned behind your backline and cautious of being engaged on from different flank angles. Using your E is a great tool to try and splat out any champions that are trying to get egg flank on you. Varus is a really solid pick. The build that's being played most is the Pope Lethality build. A lot of people have been running Duskblade, but it's not the optimal choice. Prowler's Claw gives more lethality and gives lethality as its mythic passive, so it allows you to do far more damage. The active isn't super relevant, although it can be helpful in duels, but mostly this item allows you to stack lethality to crazy levels and decimate squishy targets. Varus is really effective at harassing opponents from a huge distance, setting up picks and following up on engage. If you have hard engage on your team, then firing your Q and powered with your W active on top will massacre them and easily dispatch any targets caught in the engage. He does lack the sustained DPS for the AD carries, so be cautious about taking him into tanks. However, you can go for an alternative non-lethality build if you end up in that situation and your team needs consistent damage. On to the supports. In the God tier we have Leona and Lulu, and the S tier we have Zyra, Soraka, Nami, Morgana, Blitzcrank, Zilean and Xerath. In the support role, we saw Thresh and Bard both suffering from their prior nerfs and have moved down to A tier. They're still high skill cap champions who could be very effective in the right hands, but their power reduction has made it trickier to get value out of them, particularly at lower ranks. We also saw Senna undergo some big changes. She got some buffs to her alternate builds, to her scaling with lethality and AP, but in return saw nerfs to her soul range increase, and Frostfire Gauntlet was nerfed for ranged champions. Ultimately, this was an attempt to move away from the tank Senna build and towards more underused builds, but with how consistent her tank build was, this meant she's dropping down in the rankings. We also saw big buffs to Moonstone and Staff and Flow and Water, which definitely helps with any enchanters utilising them. Vigilant Wardstone was also changed quite substantially, but due to the fact it's still locked at level 13 and still rather underwhelming, it's not really going to change the fact that it's never really used in games. Xerath received some solid buffs on the previous patch and they've allowed him to find a lot of strength in the support role. He definitely is a precarious pick into heavy engaged support. There's a lot of risk, but if you can maintain distance and harass your opponents down, you can look to chunk them out and gain complete control of the lane. He's really effective when paired with an AD carry who can harass with you like Misfortune, Varus or Jhin. On top of this, his scaling is solid when you get later in the game, being able to fire considerable damage from the backline, which is particularly valuable if your team has hard engaged and locked targets in place. With the buffs to Moonstone and Staff of Flow and Water, Soraka is looking great. Shorty was a solid pick, being able to harass and sustain the laner phase and scale extremely well. With more power being pumped into a mythic, she's going to be really hard to deal with. Essentially, when your Moonstone is stacked, you'll get an extra 10% boost to your healing compared to last patch, whilst you'll force opponents to prioritize you as a target or simply be unable to win in longer duration fights. Soraka's E is a really strong part of her kit. The silence shuts down a lot of champions, and the fact that the root follows up on that means it's really easy to chain with your allies' CC. Good examples of this are when paired with Varus in the bot lane, you can throw down your silence on top of his ultimate so that they can't cast any abilities when rooted, and then when the duration of his root expires, your E will root them again. It's definitely more effective when used in this way. I'm sure some of you are not happy to see Seraphine re-emerging. She's getting a buff to her survivability with a W now stronger at later levels. Remember that a W does not scale with points in it and instead gets stronger based on level, so this change will come into play despite the fact that you always max W last on Seraphine. With Moonstone and Staff of Flow and Water being two items which synced very well with Seraphine also being buffed, then this could potentially be signs of her returning to be a dominant force in the meta. Seraphine's laning can be a bit finicky as hard engaged champions can look to punish her, but the key thing is if you make it out of the laning phase and into teamfights, you're a monster. The amount of shielding, healing and CC shuffers makes it very hard for teams to win unless they pop you early in the fight, and as a result she just dominates from that point onwards. That wraps things up for 11.11. I hope this has been helpful and you feel a bit more clued up on the coming patch. Be sure to subscribe if you want to keep updated with our tier list, and fly on over to mobalytics.gg to check out the full list in one place. Thanks for watching.